And now, as ever, to the front pages. As I suggested at the beginning of the programme, lots of Boris Johnson. That is quite a silhouette, I have to say there. Gove and Platel back, Platel as well, less Platel. Gove and Platel back Boris's vision for Brexit, says the Sunday Telegraph. A slightly less enthusiastic Mail on Sunday. Tories at war over Boris's move to oust PM. The Sunday Times has its own splash there about tuition fees. We'll talk about that as well. And they say Boris revives Brexit dream team. And then finally there's the Observer leading on the Parsons Green story. And Boris Johnson ought to be fired, angry Tories tell May. Well, we'll be talking about whether this is actually a leadership bid or not, what's going on. But as you were hearing in the news, Boris Johnson himself has been a bit camera shy. The way these things work, I get onto my phone and I come to my text messages, and about the first thing I see is a message from Boris's man. It says, Boris's man says that this is not a leadership bid, this is just an attempt to get a better Brexit, and that he's in favour of payments during the transitional period, not just afterwards. So Boris is already responding through his man by phone to people like me. That's how it works. Now, Amanda Platel, you are not backing Boris, as I suggested earlier on. Is there genuine anger, do you think, in the Cabinet about this?
There's incredulity. I use, my little phone comes in handy as well, and it was bouncing last night. And the first word that came up was Boris moron. That was from a cabinet minister. Now, they are incandescent about this intervention. They were blindsided. It's not even known. No one could even say, I have not spoken to the Prime Minister, no one could even say if the Prime Minister had seen it before he published his 4,000-word epic, which is only 1,000 words less than Theresa May's speech on Friday.
But yet, it's slightly odd, because it is a very optimistic, positive vision of Brexit post getting out and all the rest.
I know you've got to do all this kind of fair thing, but you used to be
I'm trying to do the fair thing.
You used to be a political editor. You know that something like this, an intervention, it has to be cleared through the Prime Minister's team. It should have been cleared through the Cabinet. None of that has happened. Boris he's freelancing.
And yet there is not a word in the 4,000 words which is actually contradicting government policy.
That may be true, but he's not even part of the Brexit negotiating team. I mean, one of the comments last night that was made to me was that apart from being, divisive, self-indulgent, the biggest sin was he was just ignorant. He doesn't know they're at a very delicate part of the negotiation at the moment. And this big buffoon storms in and stomps all over it. And
you can't call him the Foreign Secretary
as for Michael Gove backing you, crikey, when Michael Gove's backing you, you're really in trouble. He's still got the knife marks in his back from last year.
OK, tell us what you really think in a second. Francis O'Grady, we've got the Telegraph there, I think, the Times.
It's the Sunday Times
and
coverage. This piece is really trying to understand what is Boris's motivation for what some might see as a bit of a kamikaze act, and it's suggesting that he feels personally that his reputation was trashed during the referendum, particularly in respect of that 350 million
for the NHS
on the side of the bus. And it feels like he is resurrecting that promise, which was exposed as the biggest whopper of the campaign.
He's repeated it today, and he clearly thinks it can still happen. Is there not a kind of philosophical division going on inside the Conservative Party now between people who basically want us to stay alongside the EU, be a kind of European country after Brexit, and those like Boris who say, no, look out to the rest of the world, look out to the Commonwealth, look out to America?
Well, I think we're seeing that very sharp division now between the pragmatists who are looking for a deal with the EU and Boris, who is prepared to jump over that cliff edge with Michael Gove, like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and take us into an extreme Brexit that would damage workers' rights and jobs.
John, you spend your time in Washington and elsewhere in North America. How is Boris seen there?
They don't quite use the same words that Amanda has used to describe Boris, but there is a flavour of that. And also, just imagine you're a British diplomat in Washington and you're trying to tell the American elite, the ruling class, what Britain's policy is and where the government stands on Brexit. And you've got all these competing narratives, completely different stories being told, and it's incredibly difficult. because it does look slightly shambolic what is unfolding, and it's sort of almost easier to report to London what the government, the administration of Donald Trump is doing, than explain to the Americans what the government of Theresa May is doing. And I think that is a real issue.
But there is a real choice to be made here for Britain, isn't there? What kind of country are we going to be after Brexit, which is partly what Boris Johnson's article addresses. A senior businessman said to me last week, he said, we should join NAFTA, for instance. There is a choice between the American model and the British model. When it comes to cars and much else, the American model is doing much better than the European model.
The American model is starting to power, and there's a lot of economic confidence about, in America at the moment about the changes that are coming and that may be being made. So, yeah, there is a choice to be made. But, I mean, I also think that, everyone's saying, oh, well, Donald Trump, he supports Brexit, therefore it's going to be very easy to make a great trade deal. Let's see when it comes to the detail of the negotiations how easy that will be, because who needs that trade deal more? Right. Is it America or is it Britain? And I think that Donald Trump, the great negotiator, is going to try and drive a pretty hard bargain.
Well, we've talked about leadership bids and so forth. Let's move to another leadership bid, as it were. Not a leadership bid, a successful bid to be leader of his party, but somebody who wants to be Prime Minister, which is Vince Cable. He's given an interview to The Observer, I think, in which he says, in terms, that he thinks he can be the next Prime Minister.
I mean, it's extraordinary, and you just kind of realise how fast British politics moves at the moment and how fluid it is. That, you have Vince Cable setting out his case, why he could lead the Liberal Democrats back from the wilderness. It was only 2 years ago that he lost his seat and everyone was saying that Vince Cable's career was completely over.
Totally finished, wasn't he?
Totally finished.
Yeah, too old.
And David Cameron was absolutely safe as Prime Minister, having won a majority. David Cameron's gone and it's now Theresa May. Can she sack Boris or not? I just think that everything is incredibly fluid, and anyone who thinks there are certainties over the next 3 years, whether it be in US politics or whether it be in UK politics, is kidding themselves. And, Vince Cable probably sees that there's an opportunity.
We don't know what's around the corner in security terms either, Amanda. Let's turn to the Parsons Green story, if you don't mind. The saddest aspect of this is this couple who have been doing the right thing, fostering lots of kids over a long period of time, honoured by the Queen, and then this happens to them.
Well, they've even, the woman there, it's hundreds, I think it's nearly 300 children that they've taken in, and they take especially troubled teenagers, which are the most difficult to foster. And then, it looks as though, and of course this all is alleged, we don't know yet, but the papers have come down very strongly saying that, this foster kid he's the bucket bomber. And he was in their home, and it just must be so, it must really, foster carers have a lot of faith in humanity. That's what drives
really
them.
Tough thing to do.
And for them to have that challenged in this way, I just feel so sorry for them this morning.
Francis, the Sunday Times splash there is a big story in a sense. It's a new policy on tuition fees. The government are going to cut tuition fees, it suggests, by £5,000. Quite a lot.
Yep. They're suggesting that the Chancellor in his budget is preparing to cap tuition fees to £7,500 and maybe do something about what I think a lot of people really worry about, which is those interest repayments, which currently running at double RPI inflation. And I think there's, again, a political calculation here that many in the Conservative Party looked at Labour, saw their promises on tuition fees and students and thought, we'll have some of that. That's why they got the Young vote. We need to move in that direction. But I think it's much more complicated than that. In fact, the story points out that being a student is no guarantee of a decent wage at the end of it. We've seen young people on very low wages, on 0 hours contracts, no guarantee of a career, even though they've devoted 3 or 4 years of their life to study.
And there's been a lot of talk over the summer about paid gaps and pay differentials across the board. University vice-chancellors have come under a lot of flack, and this will presumably cut the amount of money going into universities in a significant way.
Well, I think that's an issue, and certainly there's been concern about greed at the top, but perhaps a bit more attention needs to be paid to what's happening to teaching staff, who themselves are very often on insecure contracts, and that impacts on the quality of our courses at a time when, of course, Brexit means we might be seeing fewer overseas students to subsidise the funding.
Right, we've mentioned Donald Trump already, but let's turn directly to what has been a remarkably important week in American politics, John Sopel.
Yeah.
We've had 2 initiatives, really, from the President.
Yes, it's been an extraordinary... I've been in Britain the last 2 weeks kind of
Selling a book.
about life in Trump's America called If Only They Didn't Speak English. But, I mean, one of the things that doesn't get covered in the book is the fact that Donald Trump has suddenly started reaching out to the Democrats. Now, it's partly to jab the Republicans in the eye, the leadership in the House and in the Senate, because he's furious with them. But suddenly he's doing deals over the debt ceiling. And so the Washington Post there, with little to lose, Democrats cautiously share the driver's seat with Trump. If we then go to the New York Times, bewilderment by that rarest of sightings in Washington, bipartisanship. And that's as well going on about what will happen to the dreamers, the young kind of Hispanics who've come across the border illegally but were given some kind of amnesty. And then you've got the Wall Street Journal, I think this is very interesting as well, if I could just open that up as well, saying US seeks to avoid quitting Paris deal, the climate change deal. Top officials say, now the White House has denied that, but maybe there is some kind of movement there as well. So
it feels like a huge series of screeching U-turns. Is this because Trump is now beginning to worry about his base? I mean, his base won't like this, but he's worried that he hasn't got the support in Congress for anything he wants to do?
He did a deal with the Democrats over the debt ceiling and getting funding for Hurricane Harvey, and suddenly he's getting applause. And I think he remembered that he quite liked the sound of applause coming from all sorts of different quarters. And so I think it's emboldened him to do other things. But whichever way he moves, there will be people waiting to attack that he's either betraying his base, and there'll be Democrats who'll be fearful about what will happen if you do a deal with Donald Trump. It is a fascinating development over the last 10 days.
So much to talk about. We're nearly out of time. But Amanda, there's one really important story for all of us in the Sunday Times.
I know you love a good weather story,
I do love a good weather story, thank you.
Unfortunately, the forecast is that this is going to be one of the worst autumns on record. And after our terrible Eileen storm, which 83-mile-per-hour winds we had with that.
83?
83.
You're comparing that to Irma. you call that weather?
No,
and Hurricane Harvey?
You're storm bragging.
OK.
Give me a break.
One final political storm, Francis.
Yeah.
1 million public sector jobs have been lost. Is that right?
Yeah. So the government has been saying, oh, we can't afford to give nurses and firefighters a pay rise because we're protecting jobs and services. Yeah. But this Sunday Mirror story from the GMB shows very clearly we've lost nearly 1 million public sector jobs since 2010.
And yet, despite everything, unemployment is down, employment is up, the economy is doing rather well.
I think it's the big debate now is about quality of employment, that people don't want 0 hours jobs. They do want our public service workers to be paid fairly. And, you know, all of us want fair pay.
We all want fair pay. Thank you very much indeed. That was very interesting.